to very formal introductions. My name is Susie Seraph. I'm teach in the anthropology department here at the University of Texas. I'm also a public folklorist and a museum curator, and we are delighted to welcome to our campus virtually this weekend one of the premier scholars and thinkers and curators of museums and Jewish museums, but also the theory of museums in the world, I think, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who is the chief curator of the core collections, the core exhibition of the Poland Museum of the History of Jews in Poland.
Susie, you are muted now.
Okay, have I been muted the whole time?
No, the last thing we heard was Poland.
Oh, okay. I don't know how that happened, but whatever. All right, and also Professor Emerita at New York University in the Performance Studies Department. And way back years ago at the beginning of Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett's career, she also taught here at the University of Texas in the relatively newly formed Center for Folklore and Ethnomusicology through the Department of Anthropology. So we welcomed her this weekend as the Gale Family Foundation lecturer last night on a lecture that she gave about the 1,000-volume collection of Jewish cookbooks that is part of a 6,000-volume collection of cookbooks that she has in her home. And today she's going to talk to us about a completely different topic, which is a kind of musing or theoretical wondering about what our museum's going to be like in a post-pandemic world. This year has been extremely challenging and traumatic for museums and other public institutions all over the world, many of which have had to close their doors, have not survived. And it's also been a challenging year.
I'm giving a lecture.
Thank you. Especially in the United States, with the Black Lives Matter movements, et cetera. So I'd like to welcome Barbara here. She's going to start off with 30 or 40 minutes to talk about her ideas about the future of museums, and then we'll open it up for questions. So welcome, Barbara.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I especially wanted to thank you, Susie, for all that you've done to organize my visit, and especially for today's session. I also want to thank Galit Petitzer for all of her help in organizing things. And of course, it's a Gottesman, at whose suggestion I was invited to give the Gale lecture, and Tatiana, who kindly extended the invitation. And so today, without further ado, I would like to turn to our topic of the day, and that is on the future of museums in a post-pandemic era. And I'm going to now share my screen. And I think, Galit, you're going to stop sharing yours. Okay, thank you. And I will share mine. Okay, I will share mine, and here we go. Now, we originally envisioned a conversation, and that it would be a conversation with several faculty and students, but it turned out there was tremendous interest. And so I think it's more difficult to have a conversation with hundreds of people, especially if you can't see them all on one screen. So what I've done, and it was at the suggestion also of one of the organizers of this panel today, of this session today, is I prepared some formal remarks. And what I think of them as talking points. So I want to lay out about 8 talking points, and with some examples, and then open it up to discussion, because this is an incredible topic and it is a moving target. The experience that we've had in the last year, the uncertainty of what is to come, and I would say the cloud and its silver lining are all up for consideration. And so I want to start with the definition of museum. Now, I think that those of you who are in the museum field are aware that UNESCO initiated a committee to rethink the definition of the museum. The last time the definition was revised was 2007. And at that time, there was the incorporation of intangible heritage as an aspect of museums. So not just material culture, objects, but also intangible heritage. And that was definitely an advance, but it was a very consensual, very, I would say, very anodyne definition of museum. And the feeling was that museums on the ground had actually moved on, and that the definition that UNESCO put forward should better reflect not only what museums were now doing, but also what they should and maybe might envision doing in the future. So I want us to start by actually looking at this is the very abbreviated form of the proposed new definition. It was actually not accepted. It was proposed, I think, in December 2018, and it was not accepted at the Kyoto ICOM annual meeting, but simply the question was put to further debate. But let's just have a look at it, because this is completely different from the old one was basically that museums are really good for society, period. That's essentially what it said. We preserve, we present, that's essentially the message. So museums are democratizing, inclusive, polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures. So there's already a huge amount of, I would say, aspiration there, democratizing, inclusive, multi-voiced, critical dialogue, multiple pasts, multiple futures. We already know we're in a completely different ballgame. Acknowledging and addressing conflicts and challenges of the present. Well, our present offers us enough conflicts and challenges to keep us busy for a very long time. They hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Of course, this is another restatement of the idea of inclusiveness. Museums are not for profit, they're participatory, transparent, work in active partnership and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So that's in fact, the definition, well, this is sometimes criticized as being aspirational or a vision statement rather than a definition. But from my point of view, that doesn't matter. What matters to me is underlying this statement, what the expectations are and what kinds of museums are envisioned, that is, existing ones and future ones. And this, I think, is very important in our thinking forward to the future of museums in a post-pandemic world, because if the heart of this definition was ever meaningful, relevant, important, it is absolutely now. So let's turn then to the question of what mission, which is really different from vision or aspiration. And I would argue, if I had to argue for the mission of museums, and here these 21st century competencies are not unique to museums. They are not definitional of museums. They are, I would argue, also a very important part of libraries, archives, hopefully educational institutions as well. However, there are societies, there are countries in the world, like for example, the illiberal democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, where schools are not delivering 21st century competencies, but rather implementing state policy, which can be extremely conservative, very consensual within authoritarian states. And it's in those contexts especially, but not only, I think also in the American context, given the last 4 years, where museums, which are among the most trusted of public institutions, can actually be important instruments in the developing of 21st century competencies. And these 21st century competencies, their importance has come to the fore dramatically during the period of the pandemic and will be as important, if not more important, in the years ahead. So what are they? Well, first of all, critical thinking. And I know if I speak for, say, Poland, Hungary, Belarus, if I speak for, those are countries that where I have some experience. If I speak for them, then the formal educational system is not about critical thinking. It is about following the policies, following state policy, educational policy, cultural policy, historical policy. So that developing the skills of critical thinking are extremely important, and museums are extremely well positioned to do just that if they are in the general ballpark of that new definition. Second, media literacy. Media literacy. If ever we needed media literacy in our age of digital media and social media, in an age of QAnon and conspiracy theories and big lies and a media, I would say media bubbles where whole sections of the population live inside a bubble, which is essentially a feedback loop. That is media literacy, the ability to evaluate and assess what it is you're actually consuming, what it is you're reading, what it is you're interacting with, what it is you're posting. This is extremely important because if you don't have the literacy to be able to distinguish between something that is credible, that is evidentiary, that can be trusted, and something which is a complete fiction or lie, then basically the jig is up. We're finished. Emotional intelligence in a highly polarized world, particularly I'm thinking the polarization actually in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere, in a highly polarized world, and in a world that is marked by increasing populism, but also in the case of the United States, white supremacy, xenophobia, racial bias, injustice. Emotional intelligence is critically important. The ability to recognize one's own feelings and the ability to empathize and feel compassion for others, this is critically important, and museums are beautifully positioned to address this. Social responsibility, issues of equity and social justice. I think it's extraordinary that this period of the pandemic has coincided also with very strong, perhaps the biggest social justice movements in the United States ever. The Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matters movement in particular, but not only. Then social responsibility, all of the issues around masks they are a perfect example for understanding the need to develop a 21st century competency of social responsibility. The misunderstanding about masks, which is that you wear them not so much to protect yourself as to protect others from you, completely not understood and confused with issues of personal freedom. So the social responsibility and informed debate, rather than the polarization and I would say communication media bubbles that in this polarized society, whole segments of the population are living in, the ability to debate, to be able to do so in a way that is informed and that is civil is critically important, and museums are beautifully positioned to address this. And all of these are in the service of strengthening the resilience of civil society. That is the bottom line. And that museums, as if you will, democratic and democratizing institutions, particularly in the context of young democracies, can play a critical role in strengthening the resilience of civil society, because ultimately the planet will depend on civil society, and only if civil society is resilient can civil society actually use the vote and use its power to, I would say, influence the government that will either save the planet or not. So these, I would say, although these competencies and this strengthening of the resilience of civil society are not unique to museums, museums are uniquely positioned to deliver on them. And so that would be my starting point. Now, as some examples, museums and equity in times of crisis. And this I'm taking specifically from a project by Erica Lehrer and Shelley Ruth Butler, who developed basically a program and conference, lectures, a whole range of activities to take advantage, as they put it, of the opportunity to use their collections to stimulate creative engagement with pressing issues such as social inequity, rise of populism, global warming, as well as with internal institutional issues within the museum itself, like object restitution, community consultation, gendered hierarchies, the overwhelming whiteness of museums, as well as all kinds of environmental issues. So here what they're arguing is that although these are issues that are important all the time, that maybe during this extraordinary period when museums have been locked down or very limited in their ability to receive the public, that they might use this opportunity now and also after or at the point that we enter into the so-called new normal to address these kinds of issues. And I think there's another aspect here that also is very key to the new definition or the proposed new definition, and that is that during this pandemic, there has been a very startling increase or rise in xenophobia, whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-Islam, anti-China, whatever it might be. There has been an extraordinary rise in hate speech, in hate crime, and it has been there's a whole range of groups that have been targeted, whether they are whether it's homophobia, whether it's racist, whatever form it's taking. And the museums here are also ideally positioned to tackle exactly these kinds of issues, and those 21st century competencies would be an extremely important first step. So we've got the new definition that's been proposed. We have a way in which museums are extremely well positioned to make as part of their mission a set of values that are linked to the developing of competencies which museums can really deliver. Now, what has been the impact of the pandemic and I would say the fallout around it, which has to do with the social and cultural, political, ideological, religious polarization, economic hardship, highlighting or foregrounding an awareness of racial injustice, police brutality. What has been the impact on museums? Well, of course, the most dramatic impact has been closure. That museums, as a result of the pandemic, although presumably museums with all of their I would say safety precautions, are probably safer spaces than grocery stores, and also many other, and even churches, I would say, or synagogues, mosques, other religious gathering places. But nonetheless, closures have had an absolutely enormous impact. And I think this is really optimistic that the museum is temporarily closed, and then very helpful to visit their website in the health and safety section of it for updates as to when it will actually open. But we know that by one estimate, 30% of museums will never reopen, ever. They will be closed forever. And that there are others who will either merge with other museums or open on a completely different basis. So these are, these signs are telling us that either the museum is not open or parts of the museum is not open, and that in many instances they're saying temporary, but in fact, in many cases, it's not temporary at all. But they're also downsizing. So the V&A to say goodbye to departments by material. So the woodwork department, the metalwork, and 20% of its curators. Or the debate over the reopening. Are museums as COVID risky as saunas? Cultural leaders are outraged over the late reopening of English art spaces. And then, of course, all of the on again, off again, open, closed. Whitney lays off 15 more staff members. Then some museums are selling off their collection or selling off paintings or objects in their collection, which is also creating a kind of scandal. And so, of course, museums are doing everything they can to try to shore up their finances, and in this case, turning to the government for relief. But also, I would say that, let me just see here. I just want to go back. Oops, I need to go back one. But also, I would say that they are also thinking about a completely different business model, that they can no longer count on, let's say, 30 or more % of their income from ticket sales, space rentals, event ticketing. In other words, what we would call earned income that depends on people being physically present in the building. So they actually have to think through a completely different business model. And so the economic impact on museums has been huge, and the ways in which they're responding to that impact, in some cases, it could be for the good, and in other cases, it might very well mean the very end of them. So let me turn now to the inner workings of museums, to objects, exhibition, experience, engagement, and audience. And the first thing that I wanted to look at is a way in which the pandemic has encouraged us to rethink the present and rethink the past in ways that are going to become extremely important in the period going forward. So about the present. When we are in the midst of a crisis, the last time that I experienced the kind of feeling that I have now was during 9/11. So 20 years, actually 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago in September. And that is it's an extraordinary experience that I think museums, which are, I mean, they do deal with contemporary issues, but we tend to think of museums as having as one of their great strengths is their ability to capture and to, I would say, preserve, interpret, and present an ever-growing past, because the present is always becoming past. It's just a matter of the ephemeral moment being ephemeral. So we're experiencing the present as already historical, even before it has become past. That is extraordinary. That is, I don't think, I mean, the old normal, I don't think one felt that as the normal days went by, one by one, that they were already historical. And so, in fact, they were very much ephemeral. The hardest thing to find is yesterday's newspaper. That is to say that a newspaper, which is, if you will, the first draft of history, is so ephemeral that a day later, you can't get your hands on it. So experiencing the present as already historical, even before it has become past. Experiencing the present prospectively, imagining what it will look like retrospectively, so that one can collect the ephemeral now with an eye to a future when it might be useful in thinking about the past. So if, for example, from a folkloristic or ethnographic perspective, we were collecting at what we called the 11th hour, salvaging what was left and what was about to disappear in traditional culture, now our focus at this very moment is in collecting the present in what could be called, I would say, contemporary collecting. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to rethink the past. And as Faulkner famously said in Requiem for a Nun, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And so I'm actually fascinated by the ways in which the so-called Spanish flu, the I guess 1917 more or less influenza, the century ago influenza epidemic it was not very remembered. That epidemic was not memorialized. Maybe because people were so fatigued with World War I, it was followed by the Great Depression, but somehow or other, it never achieved the kind of memory and memorialization that you would expect with such a catastrophe. But it has resonated with the present, with our present one. So when we think about collecting now, what do we collect? How do you collect the present? What is contemporary collection? And not only during the, what we think of as normal, but specifically under these conditions. So I have been collecting some pandemic objects. I'm going to share some of them. I did talk about them recently. So some of you may be familiar with them, but I want to look at a few of them. And I think the most iconic and the most interesting and also the most problematic are the masks. They are, on the one hand, intended to protect others from you and you from them, but they've also become a lightning rod. And they are also, in that regard, a diagnostic of all that is wrong with the world in which we live, as in terms of, if you will, social responsibility and those 21st century competencies, critical thinking, for starters, I would say emotional intelligence, social responsibility. All of those issues are playing out around masks. So, but let me take one particular example, and I'll read to you what it says in Yiddish. Dorten, wo wir leben, dort ist unser Land. The place where we live, that is our land, that is our country. And you have this wonderful graphic. And what I find particularly interesting about it is its source. And its source is from an interwar year poster from Poland, which is an election poster urging people to vote for the election list number 9, which is a list for the Bund, for the Jewish labor movement. And the graphics just fabulous. And what is really basically saying is that we belong here, that we belong here, meaning in Poland. We've been living here for many centuries. We have deep roots here. We are a co-territorial nation, if you will. And where we live, that's our land. We don't need to find a homeland somewhere else. So this is a beautiful expression of what's been called diaspora nationalism, or, if you will, spiritual nationalism, where it is a form of, if you will, peoplehood, a sense of peoplehood that does not depend on a separate territory, but lives co-territorially with other people. And I think it's an extraordinary source for this mask, this feeling, this sense of belonging. I want to take one other example, and that is a mask that is inspired also by an historical object. And I chose these because of the relationship between past and present. So this is an amulet mask, and it is based on a 19th century amulet from a book of amulets. And this particular amulet was an amulet from the 19th century against the plague. And what this artist, Ken Goldman, has done is that he has, oh my goodness, okay. So what he has done is to take this amulet and has repurposed it and made a modern mask that is an amulet based on an historic one, which I think is really quite extraordinary. Now, there was, because the man who created, the young man who created it, he's in his late 20s, living in the upper Midwest. He created, and I don't think he had ever done it before, a little shop online, had very few elements in it, and he called it Holocaust face masks. Now, what was he thinking? And I'll show them to you in a moment. But many people were outraged, absolutely outraged by these masks and the idea that one would print Holocaust images on a mask. And they interpreted it as trivializing the Holocaust, as not being respectful, and even being anti-Semitic. And I actually don't, that was not my response at all. And I read about him in a newspaper article, and I contacted him and then had quite an extended email conversation with him. And I was very respectful because I genuinely wanted to understand what it was about. So here is his statement. This is his mission statement for these masks. And I want to share it with you because I think it's really illuminating. In fact, he eventually took the site down, sold off all the masks, it's gone. But I was eager, I couldn't remember if I had saved all of the elements, and I went to the Internet Archive and Wayback Machine, and I was able to do a screen capture, to find a screen capture that they had done of his opening page. So, Holocaust face masks make a statement, inspire individual thought. Now, that's not quite the same thing as freedom, which is what those who reject mask wearing cite. They say, this is a free country. I can do whatever I want. I don't want anybody to dictate to me what I should do. Okay, so he says, these are FUC, etc. times. Whether you want a mask to protect yourself or you simply need one because your state or job requires you to wear one, we've got you or your face covered. However, he doesn't say you want one to protect others. Only one to protect yourself, which is a complete misreading of the mask. Choose from different Holocaust-related images and inspire those around you to think for themselves and question authority. Now, what is so, I would say insidious, but I just don't think he understood what he was saying. And that is, the presumption here is that those who wore the yellow star, the Jews who were forced to wear the yellow star, were not thinking for themselves, were not questioning authority, and therefore they were sent to their death. So our goal here is to provide a reminder of what can happen when millions of people follow seemingly innocent orders and rules. How can you make an analogy between the Nazis forcing Jews to wear a yellow star and public health not only recommending, but strongly recommending that you wear a mask? In the times of the Holocaust, people may not have had such a recent example of evil to keep them vigilant and weary of evil to come. In other words, he's going to saying, oh, well, they didn't know what was going to happen. We do. In other words, having seen what happens if you wear the yellow star, the mask is like the yellow star. And if you wear the mask, what happened to the people with the yellow star will happen to you. We are a distracted society through and how does he say this? Though, and many people have long forgotten the Holocaust, and many young people today do not even know what occurred. Political boundaries are more chaotic and confused than ever, creating a tension between human beings that binds us to divisive infighting, which distracted us then and surely distract us now from larger narratives that may be at play. Again, these images are meant to be reminders of what can happen when tyranny is ignored. And that the mandate, to wear a mask is an expression of tyranny. This, it's just astonishing. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And even in my conversation, finally he said, we're not going to see eye to eye. There's no point in continuing, because I was relentless in trying to understand it. And then if you would like any one of these masks in a different color, simply send a request. Okay, so let's have a look at them. So this is a colorized photo. It's colorizing of a black and white photo of the German suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the marching at gunpoint of the Jews that had been hiding in the ghetto to the Umschlagplatz, the gathering place, to be boarded onto trains and taken to Treblinka to be murdered. And so, and he says it's a screenshot of no, this is a screenshot, but he's taken it. Sorry. So this is basically from the Warsaw Ghetto. And then here is the crematoria at Auschwitz on a mask. So basically, just a second, let me go back. And so basically, these masks, the way they function is that what you do is, if you wear them, you simultaneously do what you may have to do, or may even want to do, and protest at the same time. So they're extraordinary objects, and I bought all of them, every single one. I bought them, and I bought them also for the Polin Museum collection, which I am not confident they'll necessarily even accept. But there were many other kinds of objects. This one appeared very early, the Corona Challah, which I found absolutely chilling. I have to assume it was eaten. but it's so difficult. And initially I wouldn't post it on Facebook because I was so offended. I wasn't so offended by it, but I found it so disturbing that I really worried that it would be extremely disturbing for others. And then, of course, many, many examples of intangible responses. And in this case, residents of a Helsinki retirement home singing together from their balconies, given that they couldn't gather together in a choir. And there are many other very, very beautiful examples of that kind of thing. And then, of course, all the objects that are associated with protest. And these are these rubber ducks from the protests in Thailand. And then all kinds of household, pots, wooden spoons, and that kind of thing used in protests all around the world, all during this period. And they are being collected. And in fact, the V&A has an extraordinary collection of what they call disobedient objects. And they've done exhibitions that revolve around objects that were either repurposed for protests or that were created specifically for them. So that in other words, these events, or if you will, these crises actually generate new practices, new kinds of objects, and all of this material is perfect material for contemporary collecting or collecting the present, with an eye towards how this material might be important in museum collections, exhibitions, programs, archives, research, and the like. So let me turn now to exhibitions, because what I found very, very interesting is that even before the pandemic, there were exhibitions that were being planned. And one of them, this one, which is Dutch for infected, from the Rijksmuseum Boerhaven in Leiden, they had planned an exhibition on infection, epidemics, pandemics, to open in April. How appropriate. It's a museum of science and medicine. And of course, they were not able to open it. But the idea that there are thematic exhibitions that can draw on deep, deep historical collections and that can bring the history of science, medicine, and also social and cultural history of how ordinary people responded, this is an enormous opportunity. And this was planned even before there was the pandemic. But there was also another one that was planned from the Ethnographic Museum of Istria. They planned an exhibition. Again, it was without any expectation of a pandemic, on fear, which I thought was extraordinary. And this one, it deals with all kinds of aspects of fear, starting with this wonderful quotation: "It is not hope, but fear that excites and shapes the cultural imagination of the early 21st century." Well, I have to say so. I mean, if I look at the last 4 years in the United States, if there was ever an example of the role of fear in exciting and shaping the cultural imagination, and doing so in ways that are absolutely devastating, this is the truth. So this is a very, very interesting exhibition dealing with a topic which was in the cards before the pandemic, but is even more relevant now and also in the years that follow. And most recently, about to open, is an exhibition on grief and grievance. Very interesting. Art and mourning in America at the New Museum, the New Museum of Contemporary Art. And so what I wanted to suggest here is that this incredibly painful, traumatic, collectively experienced catastrophe of the pandemic, it has produced a worldwide event that will take us, I don't know how long to process. I mean, think about 9/11. And that's still, I mean, in many ways, well, certainly in New York, we're still, in quotation marks, processing it. And we have a memorial, we have a marvelous museum, a marvelous memorial. And it is there, and it functions not only in relation to that event, but to everything that that event represents and represents going forward. So we will have a lot to do with processing what we have just experienced, and what we have just experienced isn't going to be over anytime soon. Vaccine or not, it will not be over anytime soon. And so what are the implications for our experience of museums? There's a whole new set of protocols. And even with vaccination, we will still be following these protocols, and I don't know for how long. So we now have social distancing, stay 6 feet apart. Here we are 6 feet apart, and this is a very interesting reminder that of a rethinking of the value of being in person in museums. And being in person is not only being in person to the work of art, but it's also the social nature of visiting an exhibition or visiting a museum. It is also about being in the space of the museum. It is also about not being in the world, not being at home, not being in front of your computer or at your desk, or in your living space or school, or on a tablet, or on a train or in a plane. It's about time out of time. It's an oasis. It can be an oasis of calm, an oasis of space, an oasis of reflection. And it's a very social experience that even if there is a way in which it's only you and the work, most people visit museums with a friend, with family, a partner, kids, with visitors. So the social nature of the experience of being co-present to the work, and the work itself being a kind of conversation piece, that is something that is highly, highly valued. Now, of course, the upside is that these places are no longer crowded. From a visitor point of view, of course, that is a great boon. But also in multimedia exhibitions, there's a huge problem where you can't touch anything, for hygienic reasons. And I'm going to be very interested in ways in which museums are going to try to solve exactly that issue, maybe with individual pointers that can be used so that one doesn't actually use one's hand to touch. And the issue of touch, which is so important with touch screens, is really huge. Whether these are going to, whether there'll be a shift towards sound activated, or whether there'll be a shift towards, if not sound activated, motion activated, whether it'll be that one has one's own personal device that you bring, whether it's a pointer, but there will have to be accommodation, because I don't see where these safety protocols are going to go away before the end of 2022 or even later. Now, of course, the first thing museums did was to so-called go virtual. And so we have here 2,500 museums you can now visit virtually. And that was in March. You can imagine almost, in fact, a year later, if there were 2,500 museums that you could visit virtually in March of 2020, you can imagine that there's double or more that you can, quote, visit virtually. So what does that actually mean? Well, it can mean that that you can do things you can't do in the gallery, which is to access very, very high resolution images, look at them very closely, do so at your leisure, get a whole lot of information about them that you would not necessarily get it in the gallery itself. So it may be that it is a presentation here of a kind of exhibition with the opportunity to explore. And what I find fascinating is that there is a lot more to the digital extension of the physical museum than so-called virtual tours or virtual visits, or in a sense, the museum online that you can visit from home is a lot more. And Europeana actually made a map, pardon me, of many of the, where in Europe, in which museums are they actually doing things like contemporary collecting projects, social media initiatives, streaming content, virtual tours, online exhibitions, games, educational content, crowdsourcing, and things of that kind, closed but active. So you can see that there's much more to this than simply, if you will, a virtual museum visit, which I think is a very, very literal way of thinking about digital media. But what's also interesting is what's most popular. What do visitors, how are visitors responding to these digital initiatives? And it turned out that they are most responsive, most popular is social media. And least interesting is information and news, the web shop, podcast and audio, live stream, reading materials, but they definitely video and film, online collections, virtual exhibitions, behind the scenes, games, and you can get a sense of it. And I don't know whether that's going to shift, But what is critically important is there is no reason why most of these online services that have become the most important opportunity for museums under these circumstances, there's no reason why they should go away. The interesting question is, how will these online services function when museums reopen, and how can they develop digital strategies that create a better integration of the online and the in-person on-site activities, so that you have one coherent, integrated strategy and not a closed museum and an active online, if you will, parallel museum, but rather one integrated online, offline museum. But also, for many museums, it's the end, at least for now, of the blockbuster exhibition, of exhibitions that require enormous numbers of loans from faraway places, of exhibitions that are based on the premise that there'll be 10,000 visitors in a very short time. I think museums have come to the realization that that is not in the cards, but that rather working locally and creating local partnerships, that is in the cards. That is to say, a local audience, but local partners working on a smaller scale, partnering in the region and working with one's own collection and finding ways to make do with less. And this I thought was very interesting. And this is from the Chilbrook Museum. We invite you to take over our Instagram and show off your museum to our audience. That's extraordinary. Let's make the best of it. That is extraordinary. And there's a huge, huge opportunity there. So now let's look at engagement. So basically, what we've discovered is that visitors, I would say people, museum audiences, they tire quite quickly of these virtual tours. So and I have to look and see what was the date of that survey of the most popular online services provided by museums. But there are so many virtual tours, and collections are available, you can access them. It turns out that that what is very appreciated are, if you will, online opportunities where you can actually engage. Well, in March 25th, if you can imagine, in March, the Getty Museum, in partnership with a Dutch partner, created an art challenge. And I think many of you may already be familiar, but I've selected a few of my favorite. They put out a challenge. And this is like right after, I think March 11th was in the United States, where it was a kind of a shutdown. We challenge you to recreate a work of art with objects and people in your home. This is engagement. This is not a virtual museum. This is not a virtual exhibition. This is not a virtual tour. This is not a relatively passive, meaning that the museum's prepared something and you come and get it. That's not what this is about. So you had, in these instructions, choose your favorite work of art, find 3 things lying around your house, recreate the artwork with those items, and share with us. So let's see what we get. So some of these, some of them are just like really incredibly good in their similarity to the painting itself. And this guy, the resemblance is striking. But some of them are really witty and very, very COVID coded. Or another very witty COVID coded one. There are many, many Last Suppers, and of course the irony of the Last Supper. There are many Last Suppers, and in this one, it is definitely given its very, very COVID code. Then this is from the Russian ones. There are lots of incredible ones that were made in Russia. And I show it to you just because I want you to see ways in which people actually organize themselves to be able to make a photograph. Very often somebody else made the photograph, but even if under isolation, there's nobody else, you can do it yourself. And of course, one of my all-time favorites, the Duvet Van Eyck couple, and very clever with the stuffed dog and even the red chair. I don't know. I mean, it's just really very, very clever. And this one, the laundress, this is of course Jean-Baptiste Gruz, and this is recreated on Instagram. Elizabeth Ariza and family in a modern day laundry room. So in other words, some of them are very, very literal recreations and others are interesting commentaries. And this one, I thought to myself, whose child is that? But in any event, that is a very, that one it just struck me as being so very, very close to the painting that it was about. But then here's another version of the Getty Museum Challenge, and that is versions of the Scream by Munch that are not just ones where you take household objects that you have lying around and do a tableau vivant. And this is what they are, they're tableau vivant, but also they included found objects, drawings, paintings, and the like. But here's another one, and these contests turn out to be very popular and a lot of fun. This one from the Yorkshire Museum, they obviously have a variety of contests, and they call it the Curator Battle. And today's theme, chosen by you because the themes are actually submitted by the visitors or by the audience, by the public, creepiest objects. And they say, we're kicking things off with this 3rd, 4th century hair bun from the burial of a Roman lady, still with the jet pins in place. Can you beat it? So that was, and I think, obviously for kids, for young people, that would have been a lot of fun. So, clearly, these days are over. These days of large crowds, no masks, sitting cheek to jowl, standing with one another, breathing freely, those days are over. For how long, I don't know. But I have a feeling that even when it is safe to go out without a mask, there will be this residual sensitivity to the pervasiveness of infection and the I would say that we're entering the new age of miasma. And if you know something about the history of medicine and the history of, if you will, unscientific or pre-scientific, let's put it that way, pre-scientific theories of infection, there was a theory of miasma, that somehow or other the atmosphere was suffused with whatever it is that makes you sick. And I have a feeling that we will be living with miasma even after we have been given, a clean bill of health and the ability to, the ability to go out without a mask. So what is left for us? And what is left for us is to make connections and to do so in every way possible: analog, digital, in person, at a distance, remote, whatever form it might take. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my and open was I muted the whole time?
No, we could hear you completely well.
Oh,
Up until the last minute.
okay, because I just saw that my microphone was off. Great. Okay, so we're open.
Thank you so much, Barbara. We have a number of questions, and I'm going to, Tatiana and I are going to try to go through them quickly. One of them is from Joan Severino, who was a former museum educator, and said that she was surprised in that survey that museum educational resources was way up at the top and gift shops was way down at the bottom. But she also noticed that even though educational resources were way up at the top, many museums were cutting their entire education staff. And she just wondered if you had a thought about that discrepancy.
Well, I think it's because of the difference in what's required to staff school groups and in-person teacher training and that kind of thing, and what's required to develop digital content. I just think that these really have different staff requirements. I think that when museums are really struggling, if they have to struggle so hard that they have to sell off their collection, that it's really serious. So they're looking to see where, if school groups aren't coming, if there are no teacher training workshops, then all of the staff that was dedicated to that are basically without a market. But what do you do after you're able to open up again? Are these people now, have they, gone off to greener pastures, look for something else to do, or are they waiting to be rehired? So I think that in my view, that's the issue. I mean, there are probably other issues as well, but I would start with that as the first way of thinking about it.
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to try and combine two questions. One is, how can visitors be lured back to museums post-pandemic, especially if these digital exhibits provide this level of extraordinary engagement? So that's one question. The second one is, and it's related, in light of the financial difficulties that you talked about, the museums are encountering, might they, instead of innovating, actually double down on sort of blockbuster crowd pleasers rather than really trying to do something different?
Well, okay. So the first thing I would say is that I think there's pent up demand for in-person visiting. That would be the first thing. Number one. Number two, honestly, the extraordinary experience of being in a museum is unparalleled. And there is no way, I don't care what kind of a fabulous monitor you have. I mean, I have my laptop, I have my monitor. Sitting at my desk and looking at a virtual museum on a monitor, how can I compare that with being at a museum? When I say being at a museum, I'm not fetishizing the original object. I'm all for original objects and works of art and all the rest of it. But my experience at Pauline Museum is that that you have to think of the museum experience as something more than standing in front of the Mona Lisa. It's more than standing in front of a painting. It's a total experience. It is first of all, it is time out of time. It is this oasis of calm reflection. It is an experience of architecture, of space, of exhibition in physical, three-dimensional, 360-degree space. It is an embodied experience. It's not me in a chair with two eyeballs staring at a screen. It is an embodied experience, and it is a social experience, and it is a highly curated one that is very differentiated, because when you put everything online and put it on a screen, it's all in one register. It basically, everything is flattened, and it has enormous value. Don't get me wrong. I think that there is huge value, but it is not competition with the in-person experience, and it is B, not a substitute for the in-person, and it is not a kind of parallel version of the in-person. It is something different, and I think that initially that was not really leveraged. Initially, it was like, okay, let's give them what they can't get in the museum, we'll give it to them online. But actually, the trick now is to do online what you can't do in the museum, and to do in the museum what you can't do online. So I think there's actually pent-up demand. Now, as for blockbusters, the issue there is that they are only viable if large crowds come, because otherwise you can't afford them. You can't generate the income that to make them viable. And you cannot bring, and I don't believe we'll be able to bring large crowds into these spaces for a long time, even after it is, quote, safe, because it's one thing to, I mean, one of the things museums are doing is they are really, really stressing all the precautions they're taking to make the space safe. Few visitors, hand sanitizers, no touching, social distancing. They're doing everything they can to make the space safe and for visitors to trust them. But even later, I really believe there will be a residual, call it PTSD. I actually think there will, I think all of us, museum visitors included, will be dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome and what I call the miasma effect for some time after we arrived at the so-called new normal.
Barbara, there are several questions about the role of the curator in this new post-pandemic world, and also about whether you have a sense that exhibits might become more engagement oriented. They maybe already were moving that in direction, then object based, so that people are engaging with ideas more than the awe of the object.
Well, I think it depends on the museum, because I think that art museums, I think there's a real difference between an art museum, science museum, history museum, that they're really, their starting point, their premise is different. So with art museums, I'm not suggesting that they're all white cubes and basically hang paintings on the wall and give you a little label or an audio guide and you're left to your own devices. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I would argue that art museums place a premium on creating a situation where you can have a profound experience with a work of art. I think that is the premise of an art museum, and that there are various ways to achieve that, but that the gold standard of curatorial practice in an art museum is to make the work do the work, and to do so through a kind of curatorial intelligence that has to do with the selection of the work, the concept for the exhibition, the selection of the works, the ways in which they're juxtaposed, clustered, arranged, and also the whatever interpretive element there is. So I think that, and it also depends on the artist. You know, if they're contemporary artists whose practice is audience engagement, or whether it's more historical works, or you know, for example, the Night Watch, the Rembrandt Night Watch. Oh my word, the ways they give visitors to interact with that work, you know, whether it's something very simple like a great big huge board, really, that is a kind of almost like a comic, because what it does is it identifies absolutely everything on this board, and then you can look at the painting to see, or it's something that's multimedia. So I think, pardon me, for art museum is one thing, but for science museums, it's an issue because it's all hands-on. Everything, you're supposed to actually physically do everything and with your hands, and not even about digital media. A lot of it's manual. So I think for them, it's an enormous, that, if you will, is the most engaged, but also the most challenging, because it's physically engaged. But I do think that overall, that, I mean, the way you put the question, or the way the question was put, is very good, because there's intellectual engagement, there's emotional engagement, there is physical engagement, literally physical, whether it's touch or whether it's, you know, with one's hands, literally. And then there, I think, forms of engagement that are, if you will, prompted by the exhibition, but not necessarily carried out in the exhibition, but maybe through workshops, maybe through public programs, maybe through projects of some kind. But I do think that thinking in terms of engagement at all those levels, in all those different kinds of museums, that's where we should go.
I want to try and combine again a couple of different questions that have to do with the sort of the interrelated challenges of COVID. So on one hand, people are asking, does it mean now that there'll be less public funding for these institutions? They'll rely more on foundations and corporations to fund their existence, their basic sort of function. And related to that, is that going to undermine museums as a safe space? And how will museum then address issues of white supremacy and racism going forward?
Sure. So I would say this, that when I look at, say, the funding of Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, I would say that probably maybe 35 to 40% of our funding comes from the city of Warsaw. Approximately the same amount comes from the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, and the rest is raised. Well, no, it would be a little bit different than that. I haven't got forget about the percentages. Let me just give you the categories. So the two public partners, City of Warsaw, Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, they contribute a fixed amount, an equal fixed amount every year for basic operating support, number one. Number two, there is earned income from ticket sales and event rent and space rental, basically. So ticket sales for exhibitions, ticket sales for events, and space rental. Then there's fundraising, and the fundraising is from private donors, from distinguished benefactors that give in the amount of $1 million USD or euros or more, and also from corporations, foundations, and from other governments. The German government, for example, has in the past given us funds. So those are the income streams, and I don't think they're going to change. And also, there's a big difference between the United States, for example, and Europe. In Europe, there are of course private museums, but all the main really big museums are state museums or municipal or regional. Essentially, I would call that state, even though it's not like the federal or whatever you call the state at the top level. Those are state funded, and they do have to apply for funding for special projects, but they're not as vulnerable to the ups and downs of earned income and fundraising. However, when there's an economic crisis and the state funding is reduced, they obviously are in trouble. So I think that we'll have to see, pardon me, but I think the situation depends on the country, whether it's Europe or the United States. I think it depends on whether it's a public museum or a private, it's not private, nonprofit, but an NGO kind of museum, or whether it's a state museum. And then as the relationship between funding and I would call it the other side of white supremacy. A better way to talk about it, I think, for museums is decolonization. The whole movement to decolonize museums. And I think that move to decolonize museums is not linked to funding per se, because I think that, and I'm thinking here of the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, I'm thinking of other museums that have collections of very, I would say, problematic provenance because of 19th century missionizing, ethnographic expeditions, expeditions that were linked to colonial, like for example, the Africa Museum in Belgium, and the Belgian colonies in the Congo. So I would say that I don't think so much there's a direct connection between changes in funding and museums addressing their own difficult pasts, and the decolonizing project. Maybe there is, but I don't see it as being very strong. But I would be interested to hear from others.
Barbara, there's a question about your museum, the Poland Museum, and what steps they've taken or that you've been involved in working with them to take in response to COVID, or have you been involved? I don't know.
Sure. So basically, many of the examples that I provided are examples that are true for Poland Museum as well. So the first of all, of course, everything moved online. Whatever we were doing offline, we moved it online. And we also dipped into our considerable archive of recorded events, recorded concerts, recorded lectures. But then we introduced podcasts for the first time. We had never done podcasts, although I see they rank kind of low on the list of social media. Although, about 2 years ago, somebody turned me on to podcasts, and now I'm an addict. So although I don't think I listen to museum podcasts, I listen to other ones. So maybe museums haven't figured out how to do podcasts there that would be popular. But in any event, we started a series of podcasts because we had to postpone and shift to online an international conference. And we had this huge gap of time, and we wanted to have momentum build up. So we did a series of podcasts related to the conference theme that would come at intervals all the way to the point where we'd have the conference itself. But the other thing we did is we launched an idea that we'd had for years, but never had the, I would say, reason to do anything about it. And we immediately, in a matter of weeks, we launched our own radio station. And that is not on that list of media that is popular with the public because nobody else did. So we launched a radio station. And I think that the podcast, the radio station were new. They were not just about moving online. The third thing we did was to develop all kinds of materials that teachers could use in their online classes, because we realized that teachers were very ill-equipped to teach online when the schools were closed. So that providing them with really great educational materials that they could get online and could use online, that was extremely important. And also materials for families who were going stir crazy at home with their kids and wanted, interesting activities and projects. So that was something that we did as well. And then at the same time, we continued to develop a whole new gallery that was an extension in the museum of the core exhibition, a gallery that's dedicated to distinguished Polish Jews and their achievements. And we actually opened it physically, I think about a week or two ago, when it was possible to reopen museums. So we've been like reopening, closing. And so we have had visitors. We observe all of the safety protocols, and we just hope for the best, basically.
People have put a whole bunch of wonderful suggestions for museum podcasts in the chat.
Listen, you're going to save the chat. Please save the chat.
Yeah.
And I should also add that that many. I'm hoping that I would say this, something that I didn't really stress in the presentation, and that is that whatever we lost in in-person visits, we have made up for in our ability to reach a wide international audience on a scale that was unimaginable before. And the trick now is how to maintain the connections to that new audience, where the only impediment are the time zones. We have to find out that sweet spot where people are up at the same time in California as in Moscow, and or Peking or Beijing. So, but that is the silver lining. Actually, is the ability to reach an enormous audience all over the world. That's incredible.
I think we've pretty much exhausted the questions. There's one final point about cocktails with the curator every Friday from the Frick, which is a great treat, people said. But there are a lot of things in the chat of thank yous and hearts and brilliant presentation, and I think a real hunger for this kind of conversation. So thank you so much, Barbara, for opening the door for us. I'm sure that we'll have many more. Galit, will you save the presentation, the chat for us? And
it's usually I can see where you can actually save the chat.
Yeah.
I know, I'm not seeing that yet.
I'm not seeing it. Are you seeing it?
You're asking at the moment if we see the chat?
If you see a way to save it.
It will be saved.
Oh, great.
Great. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for the entire weekend, beginning yesterday with the fabulous Gale Family Foundation lecture on your incredible collection of Jewish cookbooks from the 19th century.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I really, I've just so enjoyed my visit to UT in Austin, and I thank everybody who actually came out and took part both yesterday and today. It's really been a great pleasure. So thank you so much, Susie, for organizing this.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much, y'all. Take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.